Bonjour à tous. Je vais passer rapidement à la langue anglaise puisque aujourd'hui nous avons la chance d'associer à cette séance nos amis d'Aspen Central Europe. So I'll switch directly to English. First of all, because I would like to welcome Mr. Rupnik, who has accepted our invitation. He's, as you all know, one of the best experts of Central Europe and has been as an advisor to the European Commission and as chair of several commissions in the middle, at the heart of all the specific topics that we'll address today. Secondly, and thanks to Jean-Christophe and to Yanis, we're happy to have this discussion today with our friends of Aspen Central Europe. I think it's very important for Aspen friends to be connected with the main institutes in Europe, and I'm glad we've been able to set it up. And this being said, Jean-Christophe will introduce the topic and the discussion. I thank E&Y for the usual support. And Jean-Christophe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. But actually, Milan was the Secretary General of Aspen Central Europe, will say a few words of introduction.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So welcome also on behalf of the Aspen Institute Central Europe, and thank you very much, Mr. Rupnik, for joining. Thank you also to Aspen France for the cooperation, because I think it's a great great cooperation in terms of very important topic for our region, because the topic of the V4, it's exactly in our region where we Aspen as Central Europe represent those countries. And after unity of the V4, after a lot of also of the controversy, there is a different, basically completely different view on the V4 after the war, because the war is bringing the new dynamics to the V4. We are in the situation exactly, how to cooperate, if we will stand or together, or if there are new alliances. Would Hungary be isolated, or what is really for the future of the EU? And for us, for the Aspen Central Europe, this is, as I said, extremely important topic, because we are dealing exactly here with that. And thank you very much for not only joining our partners and alumni for today's discussion, but mainly the speakers. So Jean-Christophe, thank you very much, and now to you.
Thank you, Milan. So thank you, everyone, for attending this new session of the geopolitical meeting of the Aspen Institute, organized with EY. We are very pleased today to have Jacques Rupnik. Jacques, just in a few words about yourself, to say that you were actually born in Prague in 1950, and that you started your career with BBC Worldwide in 77 till 82, I believe, and that was in a way more or less the peak of the Cold War. Then you started a very prestigious academic career with Sciences Po and the Série, and among many other affiliation and role and responsibility, you have been serving as an advisor to President Václav Havel from 90 to 92, when he was the first republic at what at that time was the Republic of Czechoslovakia. I remember, this is more like a personal old souvenir, because at that time I was a very young first executive director of the Aspen Institute in France with Raymond Barre, and you were serving actually as the secretary or the rapporteur of the International Commission for the Balkan that was hosted by Aspen Berlin, and that was, I think, in 95 and 6. So just to say that you have a already close relation with the Aspen Institute. Today, as Milan has mentioned, we will be looking at what will be or what might be the consequences of the war in Ukraine on the cohesion and the future of the Visegrad group. I think it will be important if you can say just in a few words, what is the Visegrad group, at least for the participants coming from maybe Western Europe, who are maybe not very familiar with this concept, and we have decided to have this somewhat provocative title saying that the Visegrad group might be a collateral victim of the war in Iraq. Just to remind that in the last few years, this Visegrad group has been some sort of a splinter in the eyes of the EU, having a tendency to distancing itself from the EU, those 4 countries from Central and Eastern Europe, playing their own music, questioning the rule of law, questioning the primacy of the EU regulation over their own law, but also on the migrants issue, and also, for example, on LGBT, with those, I think in Poland, those LGBT free zone or free cities. So there was a tendency, and in a way, the big concern that the Visegrad countries would take slowly a different stance, and then with the war, we see a very profound shift between at least Hungary and the Czech Republic and Poland, to the point that I think just a few weeks ago, a meeting of the Minister of Defense that was supposed to be held in Hungary has been cancelled last minute because there was such a very strong confrontation about the war in Ukraine. So I don't want to be too long, but that's just to set the stage. Once again, Jacques, thanks a lot for making time and to address this group. And that, I mean, if you have seen probably the list, it shows that there's a very wide and diverse group of very influential and decision makers from Central Europe, but also from France. So we are very, very happy to have you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm delighted. I'm speaking to you from Prague, from the Václav Havel Library, where I am sitting right now. And since you asked me to recall what the Visegrad group was about, well, Václav Havel was, I would say, the first and very important inspiration for that. If you look at his very first speech after he was elected president in the Polish Sejm, in the Polish parliament, he said, Central Europeans coming out of the Soviet fold have to cooperate in their democratic transformation and in their reconnection with Europe. In the slogan of return to Europe was then being used. So, and in Bratislava, and I was present at that meeting in April 1990, you had the meeting, already the first meeting with the heads of governments, head of state, etc., which prepared the ground for the actual foundation of the Visegrad group. In those days, there were only 3, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. It became 4 because of the Czechoslovak separation. But the initial endeavor, if I had to spell it out, was built on the cooperation among dissidents around democratic values, help together to dismantle the legacy of the Soviet period, of the communist dictatorship, and work together, help each other, work together on their European integration. That was, if you want, in a nutshell, what Visegrad was about. The founding members, it was very easy for them to get along. You had people like Václav Havel, Arpad Gönc, a Hungarian president who was a former dissident, a writer, a translator, and Lech Walesa, who himself was, one of the heroes of the Polish Solidarność movement. So that was what Visegrad was about. And just mentioning these 3 names, you see that this was both a very democratic and pro-European endeavor. I will skip a long history and not inflict all the ups and downs of Visegrad, but simply refer to what you said in your introduction. It is true that in recent years, Visegrad acquired the reputation, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes deserved, that it became a kind of grouping that is resisting further European integration, to put it mildly. And that you had several problems on which the Visegrad countries had problems, not all of them and not to the same degree. It was mainly focused on Poland and Hungary, the question of so-called illiberal democracy. This is a term Viktor Orban had used, and Orban and Kaczynski were very, very close in trying to argue that, yeah, democratic elections give you majority power, and that they use this mandate, the democratic mandate they got from the voters, to curtail the constitutional constraints, the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, and things like that. So you had that problem. You had a second problem which came to the fore during the migrant crisis in 2015, when the Visegrad Group countries refused the European agenda of redistributing the migrants and having a coordinated European policy on that issue. So in those days, yeah, the contrast, the sharpest contrast, of course, was between Viktor Orban building his fence and Angela Merkel welcoming over 1 million refugees from Syria into Germany. So that was the second point. Again, I don't want to dwell on that history, but there was the feeling that Central Europe under Orban and Kaczynski primarily, but to a lesser extent with Babiš in the Czech Republic and Fico in Slovakia, you had in Czech and Slovaks, if you want, had populism light, whereas you had a much harder version in Poland and Hungary. That was a state of play. It created the perception that the Visegrad Group had was a kind of, yeah, a break on deepening of European integration. So in a way, exactly the opposite of what it was initially, what was the initial purpose. Initial purpose was to be democracy and European integration. You had the feeling that Visegrad was in kind of reverse mode. I must not dwell too much on the background. This was just to explain to maybe to those in the audience not too familiar with what Visegrad was about, to move to the present situation. So you have this group, and at the core of this group, you have Poland and Hungary, Kaczynski and Orban, and their particular relationship. They met on numerous occasions, but particularly their meeting in Krynica was memorable in the Polish Tatras in 2016, where they jointly professed that Europe needs a counter-revolution. This was their term. And they felt, for a number of reasons, that Europe was going the wrong way, that it was encroaching too much on the sovereignty of the member states, and that culturally it was becoming liberal, permissive, decadent, and it was a time to revert to defend conservative values. So you had these two were at the core, and as I say, Babiš and Fico as much more of a low-key version without the ideological ambitions that sometimes Kaczynski and Orban professed. Now, the war in Ukraine changed that. And, you know, I will not say this is farewell to Visegrad or things like that. At least one could say it's been put on deep freeze. And if you want a symbolic moment for that, well, that was a train that took 3 prime ministers of Central Europe to Kiev in the middle of March. Now, there are a lot of visits nowadays in Kiev, but in middle of March, this was the very first one. And those who boarded the train were Morawiecki, the Polish prime minister, the Czech prime minister Fiala, and the Slovene prime minister, Mr. Janša, who incidentally has just been defeated in his elections in Slovenia, and who, in terms of his domestic understanding of democracy, was very close to Viktor Orban. So, parenthèse refermée, this was just, there was, of course, one absentee that everybody immediately noticed, and that was Viktor Orban. And the reason, of course, for his absence is that he had a very different reading of what this war was about. And he had visited Moscow, Vladimir Putin, in early February. He came out of the meeting and he says, this is his term, there is a Hungarian model. And what was a Hungarian model? You can be a friend of Vladimir Putin and a member and a good member of the EU. That was a Hungarian model. Well, that model, if you want, became very hard to sustain in war, in a war of aggression. So there, the Polish-Hungarian relationship, the Orban-Kaczynski bond, which was at the core of this Visegrad Mark II, not of the initial Visegrad, but let's say of the Visegrad in reverse mode. And that, I think, was a crucial moment. And since I'm in Prague, I would add, perhaps in the Polish-Hungarian relationship right now is being undermined and is being possibly replaced by a closer Czech-Polish relationship. The Polish president was in Prague yesterday. The Czech prime minister is in Warsaw today. There is a closeness in, not on everything in terms of politics, the countries have their differences, but certainly in their response to the war in Ukraine. And that means not welcoming refugees, it means calling for tougher sanctions and giving support, including military support to Ukraine. So they were in the forefront of that. And I would say Slovakia kept a rather low profile, Hungary way out, isolated, and the Czech-Polish relationship somehow making up for the loss of the Hungarian-Polish relationship. That's at least one way of putting it. Well, I don't want to speak for too long because we would have time for discussion, but of course, so Russia, attitude to Russia became the key dividing point within Visegrad. It's not about democracy, liberal democracy. It's not about other issues, though differences do exist, but it is the relationship to Russia. So if you want to trace the origin of those differences, you can go back in history, but I think history will not necessarily help you, because if you were trying to explain Hungarian policy through history, you would say 1848, the Hungarian Revolution was crushed by the troops of the Russian Tsar. If you think of 1956, the Hungarian Revolution was crushed by the Red Army. So that certainly would not be a ground to explain Orban's attitude today. One interesting, if one had to trace the moment when the lines started diverging on Russia, certainly Maidan and the annexation of Crimea that followed. The responses to the annexation of Crimea were very different in Hungary and in Poland. again, to put it in a nutshell, you had a very strong, sharp response in Poland. You had opposition to sanction in Hungary, and even Hungarian complaints about the treatments of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, which echoed Russian complaints about the demotion of the Russian language in the Ukrainian laws. So you can trace the differences to that. At that time, I would note the Czechs and the Slovaks were in an in-between situation. Both Babiš, the Czech Prime Minister, and the Slovak Prime Minister Fico both said that sanctions were a mistake. They did nevertheless accept them and voted, did not vote against in the European Council, but they did say it was wrong. Czech Prime Minister Babiš said it was like shooting yourself in the foot doing these sanctions. So you had Poles and Hungarians were drifting apart, and Czechs and Slovaks were somewhere in the middle. Well, now with the war in Ukraine, the split was brought into the open, and we have at least two consequences of that. One is the at least provisional demise of the attempt, inspired by Kaczynski and Orban, to recast the European politics, the European party alignments. You may recall that on a number of occasions, Orban, but also Kaczynski, made very significant efforts to wean parties in Western Europe, Salvini in Italy, Marine Le Pen in France, other partners in various countries, I will not list them all. And they were hoping for some kind of reconfiguration of the European political landscape. This was related to Orban's expulsion from the EPP, from the center-right grouping in the European Parliament. The Polish Peace Party, the Law and Justice Party, they were not part of EPP, they were in the European Reformist group, which essentially was with the British Conservatives, who were apart. But not, once the British Conservatives had left the European Union, this was a kind of lame duck grouping, not exactly necessarily the place you wanted to be. So they were trying to meet, and they had a number of meetings. I will not spell them out, but you know, if you want just a brief illustration, in December, Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki received Marine Le Pen at an official dinner in the midst of a French election campaign. That tells you something. That was his choice in the French election. They had meetings in December and again in January with the parties that I have mentioned, the various parties of the far right in Europe, in this idea to reconfigure Europe away from further integration towards what they call Europe of nations, Europe that would basically no longer interfere in the sovereignty of the nation state. The key word for them is the defense of sovereignty. And so that has been crucially undermined by the recent developments, because the Polish-Hungarian split means they no longer can pursue this endeavor, because some of the partners with whom they were intending to regroup turned out to be, well, in Germany, they say Putin-Versteher, you know, people who have an understanding for Putin or something like that. Anyway, so that is a non-starter. If you want to recast the European, new European alliance around supporters of Vladimir Putin, well, that's a dead end. So the Poles have, so to speak, they will not be part of that, and others as well. So that's the first, one of the consequences is not just that Visegrad has been undermined, but that this endeavor of the European reconfiguration has been undermined as well. The final word, I would say, as a consequence, is you would have two things on the European level, I think. One thing is that the very tense, contentious argument, to put it politely, between the European Union, the Commission in Brussels, and the European Council, and Poland and Hungary about the rule of law. And I don't have time to spell all these issues, but it essentially concerns the independence of the judiciary in Poland. It concerns a number of issues of similar kind in Hungary, including independence of the media. Anyway, that during the war in Ukraine, because of the urgency, the need to keep unity of the European response, the sanctions, facing the energy supply challenge that we have to deal with today, all this means that the rule of law issue will not disappear, but at least for the time being is being put on the back burner. So that surely must be a relief in Warsaw. On the other hand, it also means that the radical Eurosceptic posture that Orban and Kaczynski, others in the Visegrad group in a milder version during the Babiš-Fico period, but Orban and Kaczynski in particular, the vehemence with which they attacked the European Union. I mean, some of it is not always well known, but I read very carefully what they say. And when you have the Polish Prime Minister saying that introducing conditionality for access to EU fund amounts to starting a third world war, and that if that happens, Poland will defend itself with all available means. This is a quotation. This was not old. This was last November. And you had the Minister of Justice, Mr. Ziobro, and Hungarian Minister of Justice, Mrs. Judit Varga, both have, on not once, but on several occasions, compared the European Union to the Soviet Union. This intrusion on their sovereignty, they are strangling us, they're suppressing our sovereignty. So this idea that Brussels equals Moscow at this time when Ukraine is being assaulted by Russian imperialism, and when the Ukrainian president, in an address to the European Parliament, says, I want to join the European Union because we want to build a democratic state, and we are being threatened by Russian autocracy. So for him, the choice is clear. Russian autocracy and European democracy, and he knows where he wants to be. And of course, there was a standing ovation when he said that to the European Parliament, and there is now a discussion where Central Europe's, the Visegrad group countries, at least some of them, are very active in promoting a fast track for Ukraine's accession into the EU. Well, you would not want a fast track accession to the EU into this organization that you compare to the Soviet Union, would you? So this is not just putting the rule of law issue temporarily on the back burner. Let's keep the contentious issues away. Let's focus on the joint agenda of facing together as Europeans the war in Ukraine. But it also means that some of the Visegrad politicians who have used and abused of this insulting comparison between Brussels and Moscow, that is over as well. And Ukraine, Brussels equals Moscow. Try to tell that in Kiev. So yeah, that's the best answer to the hardline Eurosceptics in the Visegrad group. And that accounts also to the fact that this group will have to reinvent itself after the war. Sorry if I've been too long, but you have to wave at me to say to shut up.
No, thank you, Jacques. You have not been too long. Otherwise, I would have used my privilege as the timekeeper and doing the dirty job to let you know. But actually, I think you presented a very comprehensive picture with the background, where we are coming from, what is this group today, and what are the perspective, and I think it was extremely thoughtful and analytical, and I think we have learned a great deal. I think it would be very interesting to get back to many of the points that you raised, and particularly the question or the issue of why is it that at some point this group, which initially, and I think you were among the founding fathers with Václav Havel, when there was this first meeting in 90 or 91, the very purpose of this group of Visegrad was actually to further the EU integration of Central Europe. And it's interesting to see that, as you have mentioned very clearly, that this is exactly now the opposite to a certain extent, in questioning the legitimacy of the EU, the primacy of the EU rules and regulation, and the EU policies when it comes to migration, and many of those issues. So I think it would be interesting to understand why is it that at some point there was this sort of alignment, at least for Orban, with Russia, and for the others, and particularly for Poland, in questioning the EU process, to the point, as you said, that it was even compared with the Soviet Union, which sounds indeed totally odd. And I think it would be interesting to hear from you also. There was a very interesting survey that was produced by the Pew Research Institute just 2 or 3 years ago, and that in a way showed a very different or a profound divide between, let's say, the old Western Europe and Central European countries in terms of values, in terms of belief, the role of religion, the role of the family, the role of tradition. And I think, at least I remember, because it was extremely striking, to see that there was a profound split between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And also, as I mentioned in my introduction, particularly when it comes to LGBT, and you have mentioned yourself that there was a communique after this meeting in Poland by the Prime Minister from Poland and Hungary, mentioning that the EU was sort of a liberal, permissive, and decadent civilization or culture. And I think we would be curious to know if also this split between Central Europe or Visegrad Group and Western Europe is also rooted in those different feeling in terms of values. I don't want to be too long. I would like also to give the opportunity to everyone to participate. So please feel free to send your question in writing. We will also try as much as we can to give the floor to everyone so that they can ask their question in live. So we have about 30 minutes for this interactive discussion with Professor Rupnik. So maybe I can ask Mr. Robert Anderson, who was asked was sent a question if we would like to ask his question in live. So Robert Anderson, you have the floor.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please speak close to the mic. We don't hear you very well.
My question is, Mr. Rupnik has given a good explanation of why there is a growing division between Poland and Hungary. I wonder, does he think it is feasible for the EU to try to widen this split, for example, by releasing some of the reconstruction funds that are currently frozen? Or does he think that in the last resort, Mr. Orban and Kaczynski will always stick together because of their common values and because they want to prevent the EU perhaps imposing Article 7 or other measures against them for their rule of law violations? And related to that, if the EU, is it desirable for the EU to do such a maneuver, particularly as it might mean letting Poland off its own violations of the rule of law?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jacques, would you like to respond?
Yeah. There are the two things. The two questions or comments are related. To start with yours, Mr. Chairman, I would say that there are divisions about values. I would, and this is the emphasis that is certainly put forward by Orban and Kaczynski. Much less so, I would say, in the Czech case, those issues are kept at a lower profile. But let's say that there are three themes in the divide, and they concern basically liberalism or some kind of relationship to liberalism and democracy. The first is about political liberalism, which is about separation of powers, which is about the rule of law. It is about constitutionalism. And this is what Orban and Kaczynski contest because they consider, and this is why it is important to listen to the arguments, because they consider that democracy is the will of the people. You win the election, and you should not be constrained by regulations, constitutions, European laws, a kind of straitjacket. Kaczynski calls this legal impossibilism. You are in a straitjacket of constitutional norms, of European regulations, etc. So this is one argument, is about the rule of law. And that, of course, is an assault on one of the core issues in the EU, because the EU is founded, among others, not just on proclamation of democratic values, human rights, etc., democracy, but about the rule of law, which means that if we have a problem among us, we go to court. If you tell me that your courts are not independent, well, then we have a problem. So this is one issue, which is the question of political liberalism or illiberalism, as Orban put it, and it concerns the rule of law and what I just mentioned. The second issue concerns the nation and national sovereignty. And this is what came to the fore during the migrant crisis in 2015, where the argument against taking in migrants were both carried on, if you want, legal grounds, defense of national sovereignty. It is my sovereign right to decide who comes in and who does not come into the country. and on cultural grounds. We are protecting the nation and Europe as a whole from an invasion. This is a term Orban used, from an invasion coming from another continent with another religion, etc., etc. So you have there the idea of the nation, and I do not have time to explain why the nations of East Central Europe, which are old nations, but whose states are recent, some of them very recent, and whose borders have been changing, etc., etc., and which historically have been cultural nations before they became political nations. This is sometimes the French have difficulty understanding. France, you have a state that has been built over 1,000 years. It is a state that has shaped the nation, and the French Revolution gave it a republican dimension with nationhood and citizenship becoming the same thing. That is not East Central Europe, definitely, where the German concept of the nation is closer. So you had this problem, and I would just give one quote from István Bibó, a great Hungarian thinker, political thinker, who wrote in 1944, a great book, The Misery of the Small Nations of Eastern Europe. And he said the most dangerous time for democracy comes, and he was thinking about the 1930s, and even fascism looms when when the question of the nation comes into conflict with the question of freedom. So when individual freedom comes into clash with collective freedom, collective independence. And because the individual freedom, so to speak, will be subordinated to the former. So that's the second issue, and the whole debate about migration and European policies and the right or not right of the European Union to interfere in that was about that. It is interesting to see that in the present Ukrainian, in the war that Russia is waging on Ukraine, with millions of refugees pouring into Central Europe, some 3 million of them almost in Poland or something like that. Well, this is the contrast between 2015 and zero migrant, and this time the welcome, the formidable generosity, the assistance, the help, including here in the Czech Republic. 300,000 Ukrainians came to the Czech Republic in the last 2 months. So there is this enormous, formidable elan of generosity, and that will reconfigure, I think, number of the thinking, I think, about how much Europe can or should play a part in migrant questions, because they rejected European interference in 2015, the idea of quotas, distribution. Well, now they will need European assistance in handling the millions of refugees. So I think the roles will be changing. And then you have the third issue that you refer to, which are, I would call this societal liberalism. So the first one is rule of law. The second one is, if you want, multiculturalism. And the third one is about societal liberalism. A whole range of issues ranging from gender, abortion rights, you mentioned LGBT, etc., etc. Well, I will not go into the debate. It is a very complex one, but you have there a conflict about the values. They say we defend, Orban and Kaczynski would say, we defend traditional conservative values that are core of our European civilization, our European Christian civilization. And those are the family, the nation, the church. And you, liberals, are trying to promote agendas which we reject. And we reject the idea that those concepts should be imposed on us. and even more, that there should be a European court that should be the deciding over values. So this is a complex question, you know. We would all agree that European courts should decide about cases of discrimination. In the European Union, we cannot accept discrimination. But the debate about values between liberals and conservatives is a very old one and cannot be just solved by courts. These are part of a real trans-European debate. These are serious, important issues, and they go, you know, they don't concern just East and West. They happen within the West. German Christian Democrats have debates about that. British conservatives have debates about that. Anyway, so this is on the first issue. On the second one, basically the Article 7, whether this will be changing. My feeling, I may be wrong about that, but my feeling is that neither Poland nor Hungary, and in fact, nor the Czech Republic or Slovakia, that is my feeling, I may be proved wrong, will accept the Article 7, that is the suspension of the rights of vote of a member state. Not because they necessarily agree with what Orban is doing or what the Polish regime is doing with the judiciary, etc. It doesn't mean approval. It's simply there is an apprehension that if they use it today against Orban, they may use it tomorrow against me or against somebody else. And there will be a strong preference in the Visegrad countries against using the kind of Article 7 type approach. There is a real debate to have about the conditionality of EU funds. And that has been, as you know, resented most vehemently by Poland. The language, I referred to the Polish Prime Minister saying this amounts to launching World War III on Poland. Wow. He said it's the same thing if you threaten withholding funds that should go from either from the recovery or from the budget. If you threaten to withhold these funds, this is like a terrorist putting a gun at your head. This is how we describe the situation. So the Polish Prime Minister is now in the limelight because in the forefront of the support to Ukraine in the war, but that does not mean he accepts the notion of conditionality of EU funds. That will be a big fight, but that fight will really take place after we end the war, or at least until we find a situation where other issues can come to the fore.
Thank you, Jacques. I think this three layers or three tracks in liberalism and are extremely interesting, and they can greatly help to understand what is happening. There is one question that was sent through WhatsApp, and getting back to Ukraine. And saying, for now, Ukraine, of course, for an Eastern European country, is seen as the super champion or super fan of the EU and the West, of course, because of the crisis, because of the war. But the question is to say, this is also what are the guarantee that tomorrow, if Ukraine is also part of the EU in a few months or years in a peaceful time, that Ukraine will not, because it is also a very religious conservative or traditional country, that Ukraine will not be one more voice opposed to the so-called European or EU liberalism?
Well, who knows? At the moment, Ukraine is in war under the bombs, and they don't have time for that. In fact, what is keeping them together is the sense they have to resist, and they're resisting an aggression, but they're resisting an aggression from an imperialist dictatorship, from an autocracy, from a totalitarian regime that even denies the existence of the Ukrainian nation as such. So I would say what Putin is doing, he's bringing the Ukrainian nation together. That is one thing. He is also, I think, helping to identify more the values of that nation with the West, not with any longer with an in-between. The choice is there very clear. You either have to be with Russia and its dictatorship, or you have to choose the West. And if, as they did, asked for a fast track in accessing the EU, at least for making the application, Ursula von der Leyen went to Kiev, they received the application, that will be examined, and I presume that the EU summit in June will at least formally acknowledge the receipt of the candidate status of Ukraine. Well, candidate status doesn't mean membership. And it is very hard to know which way in Ukrainian society will evolve. One thing is for sure is that the attitude of the rest of Europe towards Ukraine is changing, and very rapidly. You know, that started with Maidan. This is where Ukraine first, what was Maidan in 2014? It was about Europe, you know. They were part of the EU neighborhood policy, Eastern neighborhood policy. There was a program on offer, and the Ukrainian president was forced, under the pressure from Vladimir Putin, to renege on that commitment. And that's what started, that's what triggered the Maidan revolution. I don't go back to that, but that means that you have, since 2014, this leaning westward, and the idea that Europe is the anchor where Ukrainian very imperfect democracy would want to be. Has this been always welcomed in Western Europe? Well, not really. I mean, take a country like Holland, they even had a referendum on, not just on Ukrainian accession, but even on the neighborhood policy. And they voted against. So, I mean, these were different circumstances. And it was in one country, and the participation was very low. You needed 30% participation, and they only just got above that. So not very representative, but I think that the attitude towards Ukraine in the West has changed, first. Secondly, if Ukraine gets candidate status, it doesn't mean it becomes member tomorrow. The country will be in ruin. The country will be destroyed, and it will need to rebuild progressively. So what that implies, you have to rethink the process of EU enlargement. You cannot do with a country like Ukraine what you did with Central Europe a quarter of a century ago. In other words, here are the conditions. Here is the Copenhagen criteria, you remember, democracy, rule of law, compatible with the EU market, etc., etc. No, you would have to work, and by the time you finish the process, you become politically a member of the club. Okay, that was the enlargement for Central Europe. In the case of a country like Ukraine, if one is serious and not just using it as a slogan, well, it's the other way around. What Ursula von der Leyen said in Kiev is, you are a member of our family. You are politically a member of the family. Does it mean you are ready to join the European Union? Of course not. We then work on the stages, which will gradually, over time, nobody knows how long it would take, could make you compatible as a member. Why is this rethink of the enlargement interesting and important? It's important not just for Ukraine. The European Union had promised 20 years ago at the summit in Saloniki in 2003 that the countries of the Western Balkans have their future in the EU. That was 20 years ago, and it was also after a war. This was after a decade of wars in former Yugoslavia. And that train has not been moving at all. So what my suggestion would be is that you could use a Ukrainian momentum to rethink fundamentally enlargement in the sense that I suggested, to say you can have a political commitment, a number of political issues on which you work right now together, and then you work on the stages of integration. And at each stage, you have access to more EU funds, you have access to more EU responsibility or co-responsibility, and you work yourself through those different stages. So changing in Ukraine means rethink the enlargement issue. And it means not just for Ukraine to rethink it for the Balkans. Where does it leave the EU? Well, call it multi-speed Europe, concentric circles, etc. But clearly it implies a diversified Europe. That is for sure, with a core and number of its peripheries. But that is peripheries not just let there to rest and become vulnerable like Ukraine has been, but peripheries that are really engaged with the center, that are part of the center already, that the commitment actually means something.
We are running very late, so I would like to take one last question, and also with a short response, if you
yes.
Okay. And so asking Ruxandra Senyuk, if you want to ask your question directly.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my question is, to what extent does Hungary's warm attitudes towards Russia go hand in hand with the so-called Hungarian irredentism, at least in the way it is perceived by Hungarian neighbors?
Well, it is true that since 2015, after the annexation of Crimea, and especially at the time when the new Ukrainian government, the new Ukrainian president adopted this language law, which offended the Russians because it demoted the status of the Russian language, but mainly it offended also the Hungarians because they felt that this had implications for education in Hungarian in the Transcarpathian region, which is at the border between Hungary and Ukraine, on the Ukrainian side. And there is a Hungarian minority there of some 250,000 people. And so it is very hard to know. Of course, that was used in the Hungarian rhetoric by Orban and others. And I would say the Hungarian minority in Ukraine was the least important of the Hungarian minorities. Traditionally, the most important one was the one in Transylvania, in Romania. Yeah, that is the one historically that matters most. And the minority in Slovakia was often, not now, but has been in the past a contentious question. So the fact that Orban raised this question in a context where Putin was stepping in and denouncing the anti-Russian policies of the new Ukrainian government after Maidan, meant that Orban was really teaming in with Putin on this question. So it didn't mean he was embarking on a big irredentist campaign. It clearly meant, it sent a signal to domestic audience. I'm the defender of Hungarians outside Hungary. And that is a situation that you have to understand. Hungary, since Trianon, the French have always been told, as soon as they approach Hungarian leaders, Trianon, 100 years anniversary of Trianon last year. And basically Hungary is a country of 10 million people, and you have 5 million Hungarians living outside Hungary. Okay, so this is a predicament since after World War I. This is what led Hungary in the arms of Nazi Germany during the war, and this very unfortunately has created this convergence with Putin. So, but I would not say that this has any irredentist ambitions, that they want to detach the territory. You know what has happened since the war in Ukraine is that the Hungarian speakers from Ukraine have moved across the border into Hungary. So there's been influx among the Ukrainian refugees that came into Hungary, a huge proportion, a substantial number, were Hungarians being, so to speak, resettled in the homeland, if one can use these terms. This comes under the chapter, the uses, abuses of the national question in Central Europe. And this is nothing new, Hugh Seaton Watson, the great British historian, described the interwar period in his book on Eastern Europe between the wars. He described the situation as the East Europeans' private civil war. There were those who were satisfied with the Versailles Treaty, the Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, they were satisfied. And there were those who were dissatisfied, like Hungary or Bulgaria. And you had this private civil war. And this is precisely what Visegrad was meant to undo. No longer this kind of nationalist thinking and squabbling about borders and minorities. You integrate jointly into Europe, which means you devalue the borders, and you make, therefore, the question of the minorities no longer a contentious issue. You makes it a bridge between one country and the next. That was the philosophy of Visegrad 30 years ago. I wish it returns to it now.
Thank you, Jacques. I mean, we still have lots of questions, and I know it's a bit frustrating, and I know also we are way a little bit beyond time, but I would certainly not let you go without asking you a last question. And I know this is a question that would take us for hours, but just to give maybe a brief overview about the situation. How do you see the situation? You have mentioned the Western Balkans, where we have heard in the last few months that there were lots of instability and tension, rising tension in Bosnia, that there are also lots of, in a way, confrontation and also expectation to join the EU. So as you are also an expert on Western Balkan, before closing this session, if you could just, in 2 or 3 minutes, I know it's a big challenge, to tell us how do you see the situation in this part of Europe?
Well, as I said, this is a region that witnessed a decade of wars in the 1990s with the violent breakup of Yugoslavia. Being in Prague, and I remember the discussions we had, including with President Václav Havel, about the separation of Czechoslovakia. He was against it, but he said the most important thing is to make sure it is peaceful and it is friendly. And, the two nations together cooperate, are very close. The friendship between Czechs and Slovaks has never been better. In all the opinion polls, you ask the Czechs, which is your nation you feel closest? They say the Slovaks. You ask the Slovaks, the Czechs. So this is, you know, that was a Czechoslovak example, but Yugoslavia had the opposite, had a decade of violent breakup. Now, after that, the European Union understood that it cannot let a part of its continent totally adrift, and that you cannot propose to that region the same mode of integration as you did for Central Europe. Why? Because you had to combine nation state building in post-Yugoslav situation, new states were being created, with European integration. So here is a paradox. The European Union is an institution that has been invented to relativize the meaning of sovereignty. It's built around the idea of pooling sovereignty, sharing sovereignties. It doesn't mean you do away with national sovereignty, but you combine national and European sovereignty, depending on issues. Incidentally, this was part of the French election campaign. You know, you had one candidate, the president, who was arguing, if you take any bigger issues today, be it climate change, be it migration, be it security, what have you, economic challenges, you cannot deal with it on your own. So you have to always combine the national and the European. Well, the paradox in the Balkans that you had to simultaneously help to build nation states in order to help them being able to integrate the European project. So this is an issue for which the European Union was not prepared. EU was created to relativize sovereignty, the meaning of sovereignty, or at least combine national and European, and suddenly it was propelled into the role of assisting nation state building in the Balkans. So this is what creates an entirely new predicament for the EU. But as I said, and I will end on that, is that despite all the problems in that Central Europeans feel the EU has, and my God, the list is long, they should have one look at the situation in the Balkans and what the integration into the EU would mean for that region, how crucially important it is for them. And then you add a third element, Ukraine, the Ukrainian momentum. We have now committed ourselves to help Ukraine to survive as an independent nation and with a democratic project at its core. Well, if we are serious about that, well, that means rethinking enlargement, not just for Ukraine, but as I said, for the Balkans as well. That also means if you rethink the enlargement, you rethink the whole European project. You have then different degrees of integration. You will have to really think along those terms. This is a new situation between the center and the periphery. You will have to have a complete rethink because you cannot afford to let the periphery of Europe, be it in the Balkans or in the East, Ukraine or Moldova, you cannot let them adrift, because if you do so, you create a void where Russia can step in. In the Balkans, it's Russia, but also the Chinese and others. So when Ursula von der Leyen said, when she was appointed at the head of the commission, she said, this commission should be a geopolitical commission. This was a new thing for the EU to pronounce the word geopolitical, because the EU was built against geopolitics, against the geopolitics, the power politics of the past, which had destroyed Europe in the first half of the 20th century. So when she said the European Union should become a geopolitical this will be a geopolitical commission. Well, if you want to prove it, start in the Balkans. That's my advice.
Thank you, Professor Rupnik. I think it was a really very rich and inspiring session. There is evidently lots more to discuss, lots of questions that we didn't have time actually to address today, but I think, you know, we went also way beyond just the Visegrad group, looking at, you know, what are the fundamentals, pillars, and goals of Europe. So this is part of an ongoing discussion of those bi-monthly meetings organized by the Aspen Institute. We are extremely grateful for your time. Hopefully, we will not let 20 years passing before, you know, we re-engage with you. So we would be happy to, you know, maybe in a face-to-face meeting, not just through the screen, have an opportunity to, you know, to have a further discussion. I would like also to thank our friends from Aspen Central Europe and Milan Vazina for putting together a very great group from their own membership, so that we always enjoy this sort of collaboration. For those who are taking part of those meetings, you know, be aware that our next two guests will be in May. Mrs. Kudriou, who is the president of Amnesty International, and which just produced their annual report. And this will be an interesting opportunity to look in the global context of the war crimes, but also the rise of the autocrats, but also the COVID, looking at human rights and fundamental rights. Are they really at risk today? And the next session on May 25th will be quite exceptional, because we will have Mr. Yusuf, who is the president of the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and we will be discussing with Mr. Yusuf to what extent international cooperation scheme or mechanism can be rescued or saved by international law. And I think it will be quite an interesting session. Of course, we will also be addressing with him, you know, the role that the International Court of Justice can play in investigating war crimes in Ukraine. So this will be, as it was today, probably two extremely interesting rendezvous that Aspen France is happy to invite you to. Once again, Professor Rupnik, thanks a lot, and Milan and all friends, thanks for making time, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you also.
Thank you. My pleasure.